Western Front, January 1917. The hopes of men lay frozen in the grip of winter, one of the coldest in living memory. A British war correspondent wrote,
"The snow gave a beauty even to no man's land, lying very softly over the tumbled ground of minefields, so that all the ugliness and destruction and death was hidden under this canopy. The snowflakes fluttered upon stark bodies there and shrouded them tenderly. It was as though all the doves of peace were flying down to fold their wings above the obscene things of war."
The cold imposed a defiant cheerfulness. Keeping warm became a major preoccupation.
We used to have to sleep in our clothes and our boots. We used to place our top boots under our bodies because they used to be stiff in the morning. One couldn't get them on. The weather then was very, very bitter. The ground was frozen hard. The hoofs of a horse or the tread of a man's boot would linger for quite a month. And when we received our rations, the bread had to be sawn through because the ice, we could see the ice in it.
The sinews of war were paralyzed by the cold. Boilers of railway engines froze solid. Ships were trapped in sheets of ice. Vehicles slithered to a halt. Aircraft were grounded. The guns still fired, though accurate artillery observation was often impossible. There was, wrote an onlooker, something suggestive of tragic drama in this silent countryside, where millions of men were waiting to kill each other. By the beginning of 1917, some 1,300,000 Frenchmen had been killed or were dead of wounds or in prison or missing, a loss of nearly one life for every minute of the war. The French army had forgotten how to smile. An old soldier summed up the French state of mind.
They had lost the habit of the sun. They even feared the moonlight. They had abandoned the red trousers and kepi of 1914, along with their illusions, and had put on horizon blue, the blue of a horizon always dirty, dulled, and without hope.
Now the French soldiers were being asked for yet one more effort. They responded once again to a promise which brought fresh hope. General Robert Nivelle, the man who had replaced Joffre, assured his army,
"The rupture of the front is possible in 24 to 48 hours, on condition it is made with a single stroke and by a sudden attack."
Nivelle was aiming at nothing less than an outright victory. As an army commander at Verdun, his tactics had been brilliantly successful on a small scale. But this attack involved 1 million men. It envisaged, in Nivelle's words,
"The destruction of the principal mass of the enemy armies in the Western theater by a decisive battle, delivered with a considerable numerical superiority against the whole of the enemy's available forces, breaking through the enemy's front in such a way that the breakthrough can be immediately exploited."
The plan was, in fact, a return to the French offensive doctrines of 1914. It was a plan with the simplicity of genius, or lunacy. General Nivelle was cultivated, plausible, intensely ambitious. He expressed himself ably. But British military leaders, familiar now with the hazards of the Western Front, remained skeptical of his plan. General Robertson, chief of the Imperial General Staff, voiced their fears.
To Haig and myself, the plan seemed to have in it many fallacies. A breach in the enemy defenses on the scale contemplated couldn't possibly be effected within 48 hours.
Major Spears, a liaison officer who understood the French army, had other misgivings.
The French army had suffered and fought too long. It was tired to death. The light that had guided them receded as they advanced farther down the long, hopeless road of the war. Verdun, Champagne, Ypres, Artois, the Somme, the Scarpe, they were all just synonymous for suffering and death.
Behind the lines, too, the war had left deep scars.
The heart of France was beating slower now from loss of blood, from the agony of cumulative grief endured by so many parents, so many wives, so many hundreds of thousands of orphans.
For the assembling French armies, new weapons and new tactics now offered new hope. The men were exhorted,
"Keep moving. The infantry must be through the rearmost German positions 7 hours after 0 hour."
and Nivelle insisted that
the stamp of violence, of brutality, and of rapidity must characterize your offensive.
Gradually, the familiar round of preparations gathered momentum. As division after division, over 1 million men, moved into the assembly areas, the spark of the Marne was rekindled. The Marseillaise was heard again on the march, as it had been in 1914. From French West Africa had come 35 battalions of Senegalese, men of fierce courage, but quite unused to the cold of a northern winter. From the distant Urals and from Moscow had come 2 brigades of Russian troops. They had landed in Marseille the year before. They received an ecstatic welcome. Now, in France, in March 1917, they read in their newspapers of a revolution in Russia. The Tsar had abdicated. There was talk of peace. The Russian troops in France were a source of disaffection. They were divided among themselves. When they went on leave to Paris, they became a prey to Russian revolutionary propaganda. They went so far as to take a vote on whether to join in the offensive at all. They decided by a majority to fight. It was not a good omen. The Germans, too, had had a hard winter. They occupied haphazard trench lines into which they had been cast by the ebbing tide of the Somme battles. Hindenburg told the German Chancellor,
"The military position can scarcely be worse than it is."
Hindenburg's lieutenant, Ludendorff, predicted gloomily that if one of the Allies did not collapse, the defeat of Germany was inevitable. The probability of the Allies breaking through in the West had worried Ludendorff ever since the Somme. All through the winter, he had been building an immensely strong system of fortifications in depth, running from Arras in the north to Soissons in the south. The Hindenburg line, as the Allies called it, overlapped the sector which Nivelle was proposing to attack. It was not yet finished in February 1917, but under pressure from local British attacks in the north of the salient, and with expectation of the French offensive, Ludendorff ordered a withdrawal to the new line, in some places 30 miles behind the original front.
The decision to retreat was not reached without a painful struggle. It implied a confession of weakness that was bound to raise the morale of the enemy and lower our own.
One night we were not shelled, and we wondered what had happened. And then we heard that the old Hun, as we called him, was pulling out. He pulled out his heavy heights as he'd gone. And then we saw the cavalry come up. The Bengal lancers trotted past. It was a wonderful sight. Rumours all round, news that was he going? Was he packing up altogether? Bit by bit we followed. Our patrols went out. They did very good rearguard action, delayed our advance. And at last we got onto green fields and roads that weren't shelled. Almost virgin country. And we could gallop on the downs, we could see the hares and see the larks. After the months and months of utter brownness and chaos and everything going back into ruin, to see that open country again was marvelous.
The German withdrawal was accompanied by an orgy of calculated destruction. Bridges were blown, roads mined, whole tracts of countryside flooded, fruit trees in full bloom senselessly felled. wells poisoned, household objects booby-trapped.
Whole villages had been torn down by hand, evidently at the cost of immense labor. It was as if the whole countryside had fallen into the hands of demons, who had vented their lust for destruction on these humble dwellings. As the people grasped the fact that the Germans had really gone, they crowded round us, tears of joy and gratitude running down their cheeks. Many just wanted to touch us to make sure that we were real. The thing that was hardest to bear was the inquiries, the piteous questions about relatives and friends. Their questions evoked unbearably a vision of wooden crosses, hundreds of thousands of little wooden crosses, scattered all the way from Switzerland to the North Sea.
The Allied advance towards the Hindenburg Line was painfully slow. The weather was atrocious, and the troops, accustomed to static trench warfare, moved, as one observer put it, like an army of moles suddenly ordered to disport themselves in the light of day. In France, as indeed in Britain, the German retreat was hailed as a great victory, and Nivelle claimed the laurels.
Had I been able to command the German armies, I couldn't have given them orders more favorable to my plan.
Haig, whose army was to attack at Arras in support of Nivelle's offensive, took a different view.
The advisability of launching Nivelle's battle at all grows daily less. The enemy has organized the area in the rear of the threatened front to enable his troops to slip away. His object seems to be to disorganize our offensive by causing our attacks to be made in the air.
Nivelle himself obstinately refused to admit that the German withdrawal had altered anything.
I don't fear numbers. The greater the numbers, the greater the victory.
He was like a man under a spell, wrote a British liaison officer. The German defenses were obliterated in his imagination, and he could see himself galloping in the open country beyond. Grave doubts now beset Nivelle's own generals, Pétain, Franchet d'Espéré, Michelet. Their misgivings were shared by the politicians, by Painlevé, the new Minister of War, and Ribot, the Prime Minister. But the politicians did not dare dismiss the commander-in-chief on the very eve of a great offensive. Already the British bombardment at Arras had begun. Among the men of Haig's armies, hopes ran high. They had a premonition that this time all would go well. On the eve of the attack, a trench raiding party was sent over to discover how effective the bombardment had proved. It reported that the first and second German lines were not recognizable as trenches. German prisoners spoke of a symphony of hell, a symphony which had shattered every pane of glass in Douai, 15 miles behind their lines. They knew that the Canadians were about to try to retake Vimy Ridge. "You Canadians may reach the top of it," said one prisoner, "but those that do could be taken back to Canada in a rowing boat." On the dawn of Easter Monday, April the 9th, the gunfire suddenly stopped. Then,
the British guns broke out again. It was such a fire as had yet been seen on no battlefield on earth. It was the first hour of the Somme repeating, but 100-fold more awful. As our men went over the parapet, the heaven above them was a canopy of shrieking steel.
As the barrage passed, the Germans on Vimy Ridge saw khaki figures in flat steel helmets swarming in every direction. These were the Canadians attacking one of the strongest positions on the Western Front.
We had to thread our way amongst the shell holes because the ridge itself had been so pounded. It was nothing but a mass of shell holes. The German trenches were almost obliterated. There were just mere ditches that were left. We carried on there. The first objection was the German main line. From then on, we went on to the final objection, which was just over the eastern crest of the ridge. When we reached the top of the ridge, a remarkable sight was unfolded. We saw before our eyes all the German-occupied villages around Lons, the mining villages, with the slag heaps and mine shafts. And you could even see beyond Lons. They didn't seem to have been affected at all. They still seemed to be intact.
This was the promised land, and the Canadians were the first Allied soldiers to see it since those far-off days of 1915, when the French had held part of the heights. It was to remain a promised land. For although the British armies advanced 5 miles in places on the first day, capturing 13,000 prisoners and 200 guns, they had not the means nor yet the experience to follow up this great feat of arms. The British diversionary attack had fulfilled its purpose. It had pinned down German reserves. But the German positions facing the French on the steep hills of the Aisne were of great natural strength and were organized in depth to a distance of 5 miles. And the Germans knew the date, even the hour of the French attack.
10 minutes before the French attack was due, the German batteries opened up. And the fire was so tremendous that hardly any French soldiers went over the top. After a while, the Germans sent patrols to find out what happened. And there they found the French trenches deserted, except for the wounded and the dead. Full of dead.
To the assaulting French infantry, the attack was a nightmare.
And we could see that everything in the German line was in order, the machine guns, the men, and everything, and that even in some places the barbed wire was still in place. It was hopeless.
The deeper they penetrated, the more the machine guns took toll of them. The Senegalese, their chocolate faces grey with cold, were even unable to load their rifles. Caught between German machine guns and their own artillery fire, they fled the field. The Russian brigades also suffered cruelly. French tanks in action for the first time, bogged down in the mud. The French Air Force was grounded by the weather. The wounded poured back from the front lines, swamping the medical services. On these muddy heights, under the drenching sleet and rain, the French attacks faltered, stopped, and wearily faced the inevitable counterattack. Losses mounted, hope faded. It's all up, they said. We shall never do it. At French Army headquarters, as the reports came in, an American newspaperman observed their effect on a party of French politicians.
All day they were frantically telephoning the government in Paris that the armies were being massacred and demanding that the offensive be stopped.
It couldn't be stopped. The Germans counterattacked immediately. At the end of the first day's fighting, French casualties totaled 90,000 men. At the end of a fortnight, 120,000. At the end of 3 weeks, over 180,000. The Germans lost 160,000 men, of whom 40,000 were taken prisoner, and a few miles of ground. But the real balance was not to be struck in gains and losses, but in hope unfulfilled, in the bitter sense of betrayal felt by 1 million French soldiers.
We've just taken part in one of the most glaring crimes of the war. We are betrayed, sold, lost.
We've learned nothing. It's a return to 1915. They give us citations and crosses, but we'd rather chuck them back at the High Command.
Let those wall-to-the-end merchants come up here and see for themselves. Our commanders are incapable of leading us to victory. Peace ought to be made straight away.
They had had enough. The army of the Marne, of Champagne, Artois, Verdun, the Somme, this army which had expended itself with undiminished valor for 3 years, which had lost almost 1.5 million men, killed or prisoners, at last its proud spirit broke. They had had enough. Back in Paris, beneath the surface bustle of a great city, all was speculation and doubt. But the hospital trains steaming into the Gare du Nord told their own truths. Rumors fed by parliamentary deputies and fanned by defeatists of all kinds spread their sly contagion through the summer days.
In every cafe, in every bistro, in every concierge's lodge, at every street corner, the casualty figures were trebled, quadrupled.
Rumors and evasions, disillusion and defeatism, everything that France stood for seemed to be threatened.
Soon after I was in Paris, I observed myself that things went too well, even in the civilian population. I saw, for instance, a strike of the girls in the big milliner shops, the dressmakers. They were called, rather pathetically, I thought, les petites mains, the small hands. And what they were striking for was 1 sou an hour more, a halfpenny. And I saw these girls processing down some of the main thoroughfares, and a lot of men on leave joined them. And that showed there was something. There was unrest, there was disquiet.
Still more alarming stories now began to filter into Paris from the zone of the armies.
Anxious about all these rumors concerning mutinies, I decided to go up and see for myself. I arrived in part of the country near Soissons, which I knew very well, and there I was met with the most amazing sight. Regiment after regiment was in open mutiny, by which I meant there were degrees of mutiny. In many units, the officers were confined to a section of the village, had no authority at all, and the men had established posts. And I wasn't in the least molested. I asked what was going on, got rather evasive answers, but in the main found that the line taken by the men was that they were prepared to occupy the line, but they weren't prepared to fight.
The French army had endured too much for too long. The agony of Verdun, lack of leave, miserable rest camps and canteens, harsh discipline, low pay, and now the awful disillusionment of Nivelle's attack. It was not that they'd failed to win a victory. It was that the victory itself was not enough. It had not produced the expected ending of the war. The soldiers went on strike. All through May and into June, the mutinies multiplied. More and more regiments out of the line refused to obey orders, refused to take part in further attacks, or even to return to the front. Elements of 54 divisions were affected, yet there was little violence. For the most part, men drifted away into the woods, tried to commandeer trains to Paris, or just sat tight in their camps or billets, until, growing weary of inaction, they gave themselves up to loyal troops. The remnants of the Russian brigades set up soldiers' councils and disarmed their officers. They had to be shelled into submission by French artillery. But all this time at the front, the line held firm. The men's attitude was, we'll never advance, but we won't let the Boche advance either. No one believed any longer in a decision by force of arms, wrote an officer at French GHQ. It is an army without faith. A choice had now to be made between ruin and reason. Reason prevailed. Nivelle was dismissed, and France turned again, as she had done in the worst days of Verdun, to General Philippe Pétain, a man who understood men.
General Pétain was put in charge of the French army, and he re-established morale in a matter of months. I saw him doing so some of the time, and he visited in a very short time every division in the French army, insisting that every single company should be represented by at least one trustworthy man. He spoke to them all, and they realized he felt for them, appreciated what they'd endured, and was determined that they shouldn't be submitted to such unnecessary suffering again.
Pétain listened to the grievances of his troops and acted swiftly. Every man who could be spared was pulled out of the line. decent rest camps were built with facilities for recreation. A leave system was introduced which allowed men home every 4 months, provided trains to get them there, and even canteens for the journey. The troops began to feel at last that somebody cared for them, that they mattered as individuals. But the requirements of military discipline demanded harsher measures as well. Pétain reported to the Minister of War,
"It is necessary to make examples in every regiment that has mutinied."
Over 400 death sentences were imposed. Many were commuted, but 55 ringleaders were taken out to face a firing squad. 55 executions. Those were the official figures. But it is likely that many more were shot after summary courts-martial. How many will never be known. The secret of the mutinies was kept with extraordinary success.
When I reported the War Office, there were mutinies in the French army. The Chief of the Imperial General Staff expressed the utmost astonishment at this, because he said he'd heard nothing of it. It did seem astonishing that we had 60 highly qualified officers attached to the French headquarters, and over a period of weeks, the French had managed to conceal any trouble from them. In a way, perhaps it was fortunate, because the Germans hadn't heard either. And if the Germans had, the war would have been over.
When Major Spear's report was received, he was ordered back to 10 Downing Street.
Lloyd George said to me, "Is the French army going to get over this?" And I said, "I believe it is. They've had a frightful time. But now Pétain's in charge, and he's a wonderful leader, and the men have got faith in him. I believe they will get over it."
France did get over it, but her convalescence was painful and slow. In the meantime, her armies were in no state to prosecute the war. It was a time of crisis for the Allies. The Russians were talking of signing a separate peace. The Italians were calling for reinforcements. On the Western Front, the British Army was left to bear the burden alone. In the words of Lloyd George, it was the one Allied army in the field which could be absolutely relied upon for any enterprise, however hazardous and arduous it might be. Yet one bright beacon illuminated these dark and desperate days. On April the 6th, 1917, the United States of America had declared war on Germany. Now, despite all the disillusionment of 2.5 years, there was hope again.